And hello once again. This is the fourth video in the series about possible utopian ideas about society. This is LC Lupus, a person, and I will be chatting today about something a little bit different to last time, because every single one of these videos is different, so that's why it'll be different. Anyway, this one is about infrastructure, transportation, and walkability, as the title suggests. Okay, so first things first that we want to talk about here is that you should probably watch the other videos to make sure that you're up to date, because this is talking about various utopian possibilities for a society. Today is very specific, so go look at the other ones if you want those ones, which I think is kind of obvious. Anyway, I'm going to move on. So when it comes to infrastructure and what have you, now, a thing that I had spoken about in previous videos was the idea of stilted buildings, putting buildings onto stilts so that they are separate from the actual earth itself, which will allow non-human animals to continue living without necessarily interrupting human life. And when I say interrupting human life, it's also more so us interrupting their lives, because when we build places and destroy things and what have you, we are destroying their natural habitats, which obviously is preferable to not do. So rather having these kind of stilted buildings in which things are built in such a way that hopefully leave enough room to allow sunlight to get down there so plants can continue to thrive, regardless of, where exactly the human civilization is established. Now, that kind of means that this is a system built on not being on the ground. And an immediate thing that might come up with some people when seeing the word walkability is that this could prove to be quite a difficult situation for disabled people. Now, I have spoken before that we want to do our best not to be ableist in this kind of setting, because a lot of the time ableism is not really thought about. We don't really think about it. There's a couple of things, we tend to just think about racism, sexism. We don't think about ableism or, speciesism. We don't think about those ones. We just think about the ones that get the most press. But they are all very important. Now, in terms of this kind of stilted buildings, and we've also spoken about in the second video, how people are just kind of given homes. So there shouldn't be any of that kind of issue. And things are also built in a communal sense. So preferably, everything is kind of built around central systems in which people can quite easily get to the places they need to be. And public transport also needs to be built in such a way that it is very much accessible to people with disabilities. Without a profit motive, transport doesn't need to be trying to go as quickly as possible, what have you. So, for instance, a problem that I can definitely see happening now is that people, because, I spent years catching trains in South Africa, and catching trains in South Africa is not the greatest situation in the world. The trains get extremely packed full of people, and the prospect of having a wheelchair in a situation like that is one that's just sort of horrifying. Like, I don't know how you would get out unless the train is mostly empty, and if you have to get out at a busy station, that's going to be just hell. So preferably, the situation would be that these trains, also because first off, everything is tried to be built around the idea that there is no rush hour. Society operates on a 24/7 model, where people, as we spoke about in the second video, where people have shifts that change. So shifts that shift, where, say, for 1 week, your shift is from 8 to 12, and then the next time it's from 12 till 4, and so you will be doing night shifts and such, and this is just a thing that has to be done. But as we kind of spoke about quite a lot in the first two videos especially, was that concept of from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. That still has to take into account here. So people who have disabilities need to be able to easily get on and off public transport, and public transport needs to be very, very easily available and readily available. And also, of course, built in such a way that it can accommodate that. So ramp systems and such to easily get into these vehicles without having too much difficulty. And also preferably because, as I've spoken about before, the idea is that you can't just have a utopian society. The people have to also have a more utopian mindset. People have to have been taught from a young age certain philosophies and ways of being, certain ethical systems. And so hopefully the people who live within the society would also be people who, because remember, there's no real rush to get to job. Like, there's no rush hour. So hopefully there'll be no one pushing anyone out of the way or whatever, and people just being helpful and people standing aside to let someone get on who needs to get on and who might be struggling, or to be assisted if they want to be assisted. But there should be more than enough systems in place to allow them to allow anybody with disabilities to easily use public transport and be able to conduct their lives in as good a way as possible. I do think that there should be some level of, I still wouldn't call it private transport, but more specified public transportation that moves between walkable zones. So most of this society would be built on a walkability model. You can easily just walk to the places you need to go. Places should not be spread far apart from each other. And there should be, for instance, tram systems, and then also longer range train systems, but there should also be things that are, let's say, like a taxi service in a sense, where you can be picked up if you have a need to be picked up. So these things should, because things like Uber are great for people with disabilities. They're not great for the environment or for traffic congestion or anything like that, but they are great for disabled people because, for instance, if where I grew up, I lived about a 10-minute walk from the train station. Now, I am not a healthy person, but I'm fit. Fit enough to be able to walk. And so a 10-minute walk is really not that big a deal, even if I have quite heavy bags. I mean, that's not too bad. If you're in a wheelchair or crutches, that's far. So there needs to be a system in place to help people who do actually need the help, who need the assistance. And so that is an important central tenet that needs to be taken into account when developing any kind of infrastructure. You need to have walkability. And now, I would also say roads, in terms of cars, shouldn't really exist. I think that a minimal level of electric vehicles can be used for people who need to get to specific places. So, say for instance, somebody who's an electrician or plumber, if there's a problem with your toilet, or there's a problem with your electrical things, people they need to be able to get specifically to your house. And they need to be able to carry tools with them and such and such. So there should be some level of more free-moving vehicles, but most people do not require this. So if you had tram systems that interconnect with more longer-range train systems, that should be good. And also because those things can be built entirely on electric grids and on predetermined paths, and you can build it in such a way that it moves out of the way of the walkable zones. So it could be something like it rises above people or it drops below people. So, there's, say, the walkable area, and then you get to a train station, but when you get on the train either dips or rises so that people can continue walking. So there's no, train crossings, nothing like that. And also, preferably, these things should be in some kind of a contained system that will keep out, say, birds, for instance, because you don't want a bird to fly in front of a train and get killed, if at all possible. That could, though, pose a potential fire hazard, so that is something that also needs to be taken strongly into account. So, how will you account for the safety aspect? And that's obviously something that needs to be taken much more into account. So we need to have this sort of disability-friendly, non-ableist, anti-ableist transportation perspective based on walkability and public transportation, in which private cars, don't really exist. Now, we did speak about in the second video the idea of a library economy. Let's say if you wanted to, because they're fun, go on a road trip. So let's say there are some some road systems, but these are more intercity systems. Most of the time, people don't really need to leave the city, unless they really want to. If you want to go on, say, a road trip, you could go. And now, roads, because it would be a massively minimized number of traffic, or amount of traffic, it's very unlikely that animals are going to get killed by just running in front of the road and such, running onto the road, running in front of the road. That would be impressive if animals could somehow find a way to run in front of a road, but you know what I mean. So that would just be based on a library economy system. So you don't need to own a car if you live in a society like this. A car is an unnecessary thing for you to own. Like, why would you need it? Also, your entire system is built on walkability. Like, walkability and public transport. Why would you need anything else? And you could say, oh, well, how am I going to get my groceries home? As we spoke about in the second video, most people don't really need to actually have things like kitchens and such at home, because there can be public eateries that are quite commonly placed around, quite easy within walking distance of kind of anyone. And that should help. That should help people to be able to actually not have to kind of bring anything home. Like, your home should just be a place where you live. It should be just essentially a place where you sleep and such. You don't need to have some huge kitchen or whatever. That is unnecessary. And a lot of the time, the reason people want these kind of things is because of a consumerist mindset rather than a communal mindset. People want to have this individualism, and I can completely understand that. I love my privacy. I live on this gigantic plot in the middle of absolutely nowhere. You see, that's the nice thing about living absolutely nowhere. Gigantic plots of land aren't expensive. If you somehow had a property as big as this one in a city, you're like a billionaire. But here, not so much. I don't even know how much this place is worth, but I have a feeling it's not that much. Also, Michaela, she's my old girl. I've known her for a very, very long time. She's lived with me for a very long time. Hey, Cakes. She is a dog. And she is 14 years old, and she is mostly blind and going progressively deaf. But she still seems to be enjoying this place. But anyway, I live in a place that sort of has a lot of green and a lot of privacy, and I like my privacy. But the thing is, the needs of the individual kind of don't matter as much as the needs of the whole. And I think that privacy is something that is very much baked into this idea that we have to have this individual mindset, when I don't really think we necessarily do. If we lived in a society in which people were more understanding and accepting of everybody, then the idea that privacy is something extremely important wouldn't really be as much of a situation. But that's something I'll go into more later. Now, a thing I've also spoken about is this idea of society on stilts. So you might say, okay, how do I get down into nature if I want to go down there? And I would say, definitely, you should be allowed to go wherever you want. And I would say some kind of a dumbwaiter system, essentially, which would allow, so stairs, I would say no, preferably, essentially, elevators, which would also be disability friendly. Stairs are not great. Stairs are not great, obviously, as is probably the most famous thing about when you have disability access to a building. It usually means you install ramps. So, I think stairs are the most famous problem. So, no stairs to get down, rather elevator systems. Stairs are probably still a good thing to have, because if an elevator system malfunctions and you still need to be able to escape, but that does not help people who are disabled. They cannot escape. So, it is a difficult situation. So, the idea, ultimately, is that everything is built around proximity. We have communal living. We want to actually live with each other, right? And everything that is around us, this infrastructure, transportation, everything like this, we need to adopt the idea, because remember, we've spoken about how this needs to be a degrowth mindset. It needs to be a non-capitalistic mindset. Capitalism wants to constantly create newer and newer things, and then you build obsolescence into those new things. If you build things to last, then obsolescence won't really be a factor. So, say, train systems that you just maintain. Everything needs to always be maintained. If you maintain things, then you don't, it will be a big cost in the beginning, and then not anymore, because then it's just continual maintenance, which costs less than rebuilding a thing. And also, of course, say, whenever you hear about these horrible disasters where bridges or whatever were not maintained, and so just through regular aging, because things do not last forever, they just collapse and people die. And that is a huge cost that was entirely unnecessary if it had just been maintained rather than left to just rot. So everything needs to be built to be maintained rather than to go obsolete. And if there's no profit motive, there will not be a supposed need for obsolescence. And in an anti-consumerist mindset, people won't be like, oh, I need to have the new thing, because it's unnecessary to have the new thing in a society like that. I would actually say most people probably survive better when things aren't constantly like a new model of this phone every 6 months. That is not necessary. It really isn't. It's just a money-making ploy. There are such mild improvements between these things. Like, I always laugh when you get the people who are absolutely mad for phones. They're just like, oh yes, I love phones. And when the new iPhone comes out, the new Samsung Galaxy comes out, whatever. Oh, look, the camera is slightly better. It's the same people who get super excited about a new gaming console. You know, once upon a time, there were huge leaps between consoles. So the PlayStation 1, it looked terrible. Everything looked kind of terrible. Anything 3D, at least, looked terrible. Then PS2, everything looked a bit better. Massive improvement, though. Like, it actually looked like people rather than just weird shapes. And then PS3, you're like, oh, wow, this is looking really, really good. And then PS4, you're like, well, I mean, it's not that much better. And then PS5, you're like, well, I mean, yeah, that. And then we start being like, oh, ray tracing is so amazing, rather than sort of focusing on the fact that we've gotten extremely advanced, and eventually you're going to get a ceiling effect. Eventually, we're going to be able to have animation that looks like real life. And you can't really make something look more real than real life without making it look uncanny. So there's going to be a ceiling effect. And that's just going to happen. And in many ways, like, phones are becoming better and better. When a phone can take a picture as well as a top-of-the-line camera, when that happens, there will no longer be a need to improve cameras. Because if a camera can take a picture that looks exactly like real life, then there is no more improvements that can be made, except in extremely specific things. But say once we improve the zoom to the point where it doesn't blur at all, and you can zoom in, you know, a kilometer, there's not really any improvements that can be made. So the idea that we need to always have new things is nonsense. Rather, maintenance. Maintenance is a much more viable solution, with the big things coming when big changes are actually made. You know, there's a big difference between, like, the Nokia 3310 and an iPhone. That's a huge jump. But between those two were lots of little iterations that were not really necessary. If we all had a phone, and then 5 years later we were given a vastly improved phone, that would be better than every year there being a slight little dabbly bit better camera with an extra 0.5 megapixel. You know, it's just built around hype and consumerism, which is not the system you want to have. So we don't want to always be constantly iterating on things. Iteration is important in lab settings, but it's not really important in a societal setting. You want to have major overhauls when major overhauls are necessary. Otherwise, maintenance and keeping things just going, keeping things working, keeping things functioning so that they don't break, that is much, much better. In South Africa, we have, for instance, pothole problems. We have huge potholes. I myself there was one day, driving with my fiancée, we hit a pothole, it destroyed the wheel, so we had to put on a spare tire, but we were driving somewhere, and we drove somewhere, and on the way back, we hit another pothole that popped the spare tire. So that's because the roads aren't maintained. If roads are maintained, there will be no punctures like this, there'll be no popping tires. If trains are maintained, then trains won't go down. If the electricity system is maintained, then there will not be what we have in South Africa. We have a thing called load shedding, where we have scheduled power outages. That wouldn't happen if we had proper maintenance the entire time, rather than letting things rot and fall apart. I recently saw a news story where apparently one of our power plants doesn't even work because one of the chimneys just broke, and so it hasn't been producing anything for like a year. That is because of a lack of maintenance. If you just maintain things, then things actually work. So that is how it should be built, and that's how everything should be built. So public transport, constantly maintained, roads, constantly maintained, everything constantly maintained. Don't wait for things to break. Make sure they don't break. And when things do break, fix them properly and not cheaply. Another good example would be, for instance, we're having some things done on our home because our home is very old and it was built cheaply. One of the doors doesn't really open. You have to pull it really hard, and it doesn't lock into place properly. The guy who fixed it didn't tell us that he was fixing it. He was fixing other things, and then he was like, "Oh, I also fixed your door." And I said to him, "Well, what was wrong? Was it because it's just old?" No, not old. Cheaply made. There wasn't a support structure over the door, so the wall is slowly falling into the door. That's why it's hard to open, because it has more pressure pushing into it. That shouldn't happen. You build things to last, and then you maintain them. So you don't build things cheaply and terribly. And also, just as a quick aside, you don't build houses out of wood. I don't know. I don't want to have massively disparaging comments about America in these videos, but I do not understand why the majority of their buildings are made from firewood. It doesn't make sense. I don't know if tornadoes can rip out, say for instance this house. This house is built on a solid concrete foundation. It uses bricks. It's sturdy. Yeah, it's very old, so maybe this one would break. But a house that was just built out of bricks and mortar and all that kind of stuff, I don't think it's going to fly away in a tornado. But wood does. Wood is very easy to break. You can also break into, for instance, wood with an axe. It's hard to, there could theoretically be someone who breaks into your house by destroying your wall in America. That can't happen here. Try and get someone to break through a concrete wall. You're going to have a sledgehammer. Can't just have a little axe and hack away at it for a bit. But anyway, I digress. Build things to last. Don't make them out of firewood. And try to build everything in such a way that it is as sturdy as possible and that it is constantly maintained. And yeah, I think that's where I will end. Oh, also, I just wanted to also say this little thing is that because everything's built around proximity, it's kind of an anti-commute system. Because commutes are terrible. People who don't have commutes are very, very lucky people. At the moment, I do not have a commute. I work from home, which is very, very nice. It does also mean I make less money, but it is at least nice to not have to commute. But I have many, many times had jobs with commutes. For instance, a train, where I had to catch a train that broke down all the time. An hour to work, an hour from work, extremely tightly packed, full of people. They were always late. They were never on time. They would often just randomly stop. Literally, I once had a train, the power went out, and the train stopped maybe 100 meters from... which to Americans, 100 meters is I don't know, a mile is 1.6 kilometers, and a kilometer is 1,000 meters. So it's a tenth of a kilometer, which is, I don't know, a 15th of a mile. Very short, you can easily walk that. The train just stopped, and the doors refused to open. And we sat there for 2 hours. That is the kind of thing that should not be allowed to happen. Public transport should be built on a system in which it's constantly flowing, it's constantly maintained. It doesn't just break down. Something like a train shouldn't be sitting there being like, oh, I can't start the train, so I guess there's no train for the next 3 hours. That should not happen. Constant maintenance to make sure stuff like this doesn't happen. But anyway, I'm going to end there because otherwise I'm going to keep rambling. So this has been this video. I already closed this document again. Why do I keep doing that? The next video, the 5th video, is called Consumption, Goods, and Materialism. And also, just to preface this, when I say materialism, I do not mean in the religious aspect or the Marxist aspect. We're not talking about sort of material existence over sort of idealistic existence. We're talking about materialism as in more like consumerism, being materialistic. That's the kind of materialism I'm talking about. But yeah, we will finish here. I have been LC Lupus. I mean, I've always been LC Lupus, I suppose. But anyway, I am LC Lupus. You can check me out on Twitter at LC_Lupus. Also Instagram, where I post pictures of animals and plants. I mean, I like plants and animals, so, maybe you will too. You never know. You can also check me out. You can check out my books. So far, just one book. In the description, you'll find things for Wolf Dog Publishing, in which you can find my first book, which is The Cyborg Wilderness, which is a post-apocalyptic, hopeful story about a cyborg who tries to essentially rebuild the world, to try to bring it back from death. It's a very hopeful story, and it's written in an intentionally stunted style. Go check it out. Maybe you like it. You never know. And then I think that will be everything then. I hope that you... Oh, first, do all the YouTube things. Like, comment, subscribe, share, tell everybody how you absolutely love, just love these videos. Anyway, so yes, I hope that you have a great day, week, month ahead, and goodbye. Ta-ta.